The bustling family courthouse had seen countless stories unfold within its walls, but on this particular Tuesday morning, something extraordinary was about to happen. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge adjusted his reading glasses, preparing for what he thought would be just another routine adoption hearing. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting warm squares of light across the polished wooden floors. The gentle hum of the air conditioning and the soft murmur of voices created a backdrop for the scene that was about to unfold. In walked two small figures, 7-year-old twins, hand in hand, their shoes making tiny squeaking sounds against the floor. These weren't just any children, they were survivors. For 3 years, they had bounced from one foster home to another, carrying their few belongings in worn backpacks and their hopes in their hearts. Their story was all too familiar in the foster care system. A mother who loved them but couldn't overcome her struggles with addiction, eventually making the heartbreaking decision to surrender her parental rights. The twins sat quietly in the front row, their feet barely touching the ground from the tall courtroom chairs. The girl, the older of the two by 8 minutes, kept straightening her yellow dress, while her brother fiddled with the collar of his too big dress shirt, clearly borrowed or handed down. Despite their nervous gestures, there was something remarkable about their presence, a quiet dignity that seemed beyond their years. The judge, a distinguished man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind his glasses, had been on the bench for 15 years. He'd handled hundreds of cases involving children, each one leaving its mark on his heart. But something felt different today. Maybe it was the way the twins kept glancing up at him with a mixture of curiosity and hope, or perhaps it was the unusual intensity in their social worker's expression. As he began reviewing the case files, the usual courtroom sounds faded into the background. The papers told a story of resilience. 2 children who, despite every setback, maintained excellent grades in school, never gave up hope, and somehow managed to keep their spirits bright. Their current foster placement was meant to be temporary, just another stop in their journey through the system. The social worker stood to give her report, her voice steady as she detailed the twins' progress. They were healthy, she noted, adjusting well in school, and showing remarkable emotional resilience. But it was what she didn't say that spoke volumes. These children needed more than just another temporary home. They needed permanence, stability, and most importantly, they needed love. What happened next would change everything. As the judge prepared to move forward with the standard placement review, the little girl in the yellow dress suddenly stood up. Her brother's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly followed suit, standing beside his sister in silent support. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes turning to these 2 small figures who seemed to have gathered every ounce of courage they possessed. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression gentle as he waited to hear what this young lady had to say. Nobody could have predicted the words that would come next, words that would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only their lives but would touch the hearts of everyone in that courtroom. Time seemed to stand still in that moment, the ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead, the morning sun now fully illuminating the room, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, love, and the power of a child's simple wish. What made this moment even more poignant was the complete naturalness of it all. No rehearsed speeches, no coached responses, just pure, unfiltered hope shining in the eyes of 2 children who had decided to take their fate into their own hands. The little girl's voice rang out clear and strong in the hushed courtroom, carrying a confidence that made everyone lean forward in their seats. "Your Honor," she began, her small hands clasped together to stop them from trembling. "We've been watching you." Her brother nodded vigorously beside her, his eyes wide with hope. What happened next left the entire courtroom breathless. "We found an old picture of our daddy," she continued, pulling a worn photograph from her pocket. "And sir, you look just like him." Her voice grew softer but more determined as she spoke the words that would change everything. Would you maybe want to be our daddy instead?" The normally composed judge felt his heart skip a beat. In 15 years on the bench, he'd heard countless testimonies, witnessed numerous emotional moments, but nothing had prepared him for this. The simplicity and innocence of the request struck him deeply. Here were two children who had faced more challenges in their short lives than many adults, showing the courage to reach out and ask for what they needed most, a father. The court clerk dropped her pen, the soft clatter echoing in the silent room. The social worker's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to maintain her professional composure. Even the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations had stopped completely. It was as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The boy, though quieter than his sister, stepped forward too. "We're really good kids," he added softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We do our homework and everything." The simplicity of his promise, spoken with such earnest hope, brought a lump to everyone's throat. For a moment, the judge sat completely still, his reading glasses forgotten in his hand. Through his years of service, he maintained professional distance, making decisions based on facts and regulations. But these children had just bypassed every formal procedure and gone straight to the heart of the matter with their honest request. The social worker stepped forward, ready to intervene, probably to explain to the children why such a request wasn't possible. But before she could speak, something remarkable happened. The judge raised his hand gently, not to silence her, but to ask for a moment. His eyes never left the children's faces. Looking at them, he saw more than just two foster kids in borrowed clothes. He saw courage in their straight backs and hope in their unwavering gazes. He saw strength in how they held hands, supporting each other. Most of all, he saw what he'd been missing in his own life without even realizing it. The little girl was still holding out the photograph, her arm starting to tremble slightly from being held up so long. The judge finally found his voice, though it wasn't quite as steady as usual. "May I see that picture?" he asked gently. As she walked up to hand it to him, her shoes making soft tapping sounds on the courtroom floor, everyone watched in amazed silence. The photograph was creased and worn, clearly handled many times by small fingers. It showed a smiling man with kind eyes, and indeed, there was a striking resemblance to the judge. The coincidence was extraordinary, almost like fate had played a hand in bringing them to this moment. A warm ray of sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, falling across the judge's desk just as he looked up from the photograph. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew they were witnessing something special, not just a legal proceeding, but the possible beginning of something beautiful and unexpected. No one could have predicted how this simple request would set in motion a chain of events that would touch not just these three lives, but the entire community. The story of two brave children who dared to ask for what they wanted most in the world was about to become something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. That evening, after the courthouse had emptied and the hallways grew quiet, the judge sat alone in his chambers. The twins' photograph lay on his desk, and his coffee had long since gone cold. The events of the morning kept playing over in his mind, like a movie he couldn't stop watching. 5 years had passed since he lost his wife to cancer. They had always talked about having children, but somehow the timing never seemed right. First, it was law school, then building his career, and finally, her illness. Now, at 52, he found himself living alone in a house that felt too big, with only his work to fill the empty hours. He picked up his phone and looked at the background picture. A photo of him and his wife on their last vacation together. She would have loved those twins, he thought. He could almost hear her laugh, could almost see her shaking her head at him, saying, "Sometimes the best gifts in life come in unexpected packages." Sleep didn't come easy that night. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with possibilities and concerns. The practical side of him, the judge who knew every letter of the law, listed all the reasons why this was complicated. There would be ethical considerations, paperwork, evaluations. He'd have to recuse himself from the case immediately. Some might even question his motives. But then he remembered the hope in those children's eyes. He thought about their courage in speaking up, in asking for what they needed. In all his years on the bench, he'd seen so many kids who had given up hope, who had learned to expect disappointment. But these twins still believed in possibilities. They still had faith that someone would choose them. The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His usual morning routine of reviewing cases felt different somehow. Between each file, his thoughts kept drifting to the twins. What were they doing right now? Were they worried about what would happen next? Did they think he had dismissed their request? During his lunch break, he found himself walking to the courthouse cafeteria, something he rarely did. Usually, he ate in his chambers while working. But today, he needed to move to think. As he stood in line for coffee, he overheard two social workers discussing a family that had successfully adopted siblings. His heart skipped a beat. Back in his office, he opened his laptop and began researching. Foster parent requirements, adoption procedures, support systems for single parents. He read it all. The more he read, the more he realized how much his life would change. No more quiet evenings with a book. No more spontaneous weekend trips. His orderly world would be turned upside down. But then he remembered something his wife used to say. Life isn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It's about making moments perfect. She had always been wiser than him about these things. Looking around his office, at the law books and certificates on the walls, he realized that success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. He picked up his phone and called his sister, his closest family member. As he explained the situation, his voice grew stronger, more certain. She listened quietly, and when he finished, she said something that brought tears to his eyes. Those kids didn't just choose you. They woke you up. By the end of that day, the judge had made his decision. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, questions, and probably some criticism. But for the first time in 5 years, he felt truly alive. Sometimes, he realized, the most important judgments we make aren't about the law at all. They're about opening our hearts to new possibilities. The sun was setting as he gathered his things to leave, casting long shadows across his office floor. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters in our lives begin with someone else turning the page for us. The next morning, the judge walked into the courthouse with a new purpose in his step. His first stop wasn't his chambers, but rather the office of the court's ethics committee. The secretary looked surprised to see him there so early, but she quickly ushered him in to meet with the head of the committee. I need to recuse myself from a case, he began, sitting down in the leather chair across from his colleague's desk. As he explained the situation, he watched the expressions change on his fellow judge's face. Surprise, concern, and then something that looked almost like understanding. You know this is highly unusual, the committee head said, leaning back in his chair. In all my years here, I've never encountered anything quite like this. He paused, looking at a family photo on his own desk. But then again, maybe that's exactly why it deserves consideration. The paperwork to step down from the case took less than an hour to complete. The harder part came next, beginning the process to become certified as a foster parent. The judge found himself sitting in a tiny chair in the foster care office, filling out forms that asked about everything from his income to his childhood experiences. Sir, you understand this process isn't quick, the social worker explained gently. She was trying to hide her amazement at seeing a judge on the other side of her desk. There will be home studies, background checks, training classes. Even with your position, we can't skip any steps. He nodded, pen moving steadily across the papers. I wouldn't want you to, he replied. These children deserve someone who's gone through every proper check and preparation. His answer seemed to impress her, and she gave him a warm smile as she handed him another stack of forms. Word spread quickly through the courthouse. The judge overheard whispers in the hallways, caught colleagues giving him curious looks. Some were supportive, offering advice from their own experiences as parents. Others were more skeptical, questioning whether this was appropriate for someone in his position. One afternoon, as he was leaving a particularly long training session for prospective foster parents, he ran into an old friend, a retired judge who had mentored him early in his career. They ended up getting coffee together, and his friend shared something that stuck with him. "You know," the older man said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "in all our years of making decisions that affect families, maybe this is the most important family decision you'll ever make." He smiled. Sometimes life's greatest opportunities come disguised as impossible situations. The twins, meanwhile, were still in their temporary foster home. The judge had to be careful about contact during this period. Everything had to go through proper channels. But he was allowed to send them a letter, carefully worded and reviewed by the social worker, letting them know he was taking steps to possibly become a foster parent. Their response came a week later, a handmade card covered in glitter and careful handwriting. Inside, they had drawn a picture of 3 stick figures standing in front of what looked like a courthouse. The smallest details touched his heart. They had drawn his glasses and even included his favorite coffee mug that he always kept on his bench. Some evenings, as he attended parenting classes alongside other prospective foster parents, he found himself taking notes as diligently as he had in law school. He learned about trauma-informed care, attachment theory, and the unique challenges of adopting older children. Each piece of information made him more certain about his decision. His sister helped him begin preparing his house, turning his home office into a potential bedroom for the twins. As they moved furniture and looked at paint samples, she caught him staring at the empty room with a mix of hope and nervousness. "You know," she said, putting a comforting hand on his shoulder, "some of the best families aren't born, they're built. One brave decision at a time." Looking around the room that might soon be filled with children's laughter, he knew she was right. Sometimes the most meaningful changes in life come from daring to break our own patterns. 6 months into the process, the judge found himself sitting on a park bench, watching the twins play on the swings during their first supervised visit. The social worker sat nearby, taking notes, but he barely noticed her presence. His attention was completely captured by the children's laughter floating across the playground. The little girl pumped her legs harder on the swing, trying to go higher. "Watch me," she called out excitedly. "I can almost touch the sky." Her brother, more cautious, swung at a steady pace, but his eyes sparkled with the same joy. The judge found himself holding his breath each time they swung particularly high, fighting the urge to tell them to be careful. During their afternoon snack break, the twins shyly shared their school stories. The girl pulled out her math homework, explaining how she was struggling with fractions. The judge listened carefully, then pulled out a paper napkin, drawing circles and dividing them into parts to help explain. Her face lit up when she finally understood, and she quickly showed her brother what she had learned. "You explain better than our teacher," the boy said quietly, munching on his sandwich. Such a simple comment, but it made the judge's heart swell with unexpected pride. He noticed how the boy always made sure his sister had enough to eat before finishing his own food, a small sign of the protective bond between them. Their next visit was at the library. The twins had mentioned loving books, so the judge got special permission for this outing. The girl immediately headed for the science section, pulling out books about becoming a doctor. Her brother lingered in the teaching section, shyly admitting he wanted to help other kids learn someday. As they sat at a small table, books spread around them, the judge noticed how the twins had their own way of communicating, a raised eyebrow here, a gentle nudge there. They had developed their own silent language through years of looking out for each other. He found himself wanting to learn this language too. During another visit, the twins taught him their special handshake, something they had created in their first foster home. It took him several tries to get it right, his judicial dignity forgotten as he concentrated on the complicated sequence of claps and fist bumps. When he finally mastered it, their proud smiles were worth every moment of practice. The boy, usually quiet, opened up one afternoon while they were planting flowers in the community garden. Another supervised activity. "Did you always want to be a judge?" he asked, carefully patting soil around a small plant. The judge shared stories about his childhood dream of helping people, watching the boy's eyes grow wide with interest. The girl had a harder moment during their next visit. She accidentally spilled her juice and froze, clearly expecting anger or punishment. Instead, the judge calmly helped her clean up, telling her about all the times he had spilled things too. Slowly, her tense shoulders relaxed, and she gave him a tentative smile. They discovered shared interests. All three loved basketball, though the twins were definitely better players. They taught the judge their favorite playground games, and he shared his terrible jokes that somehow made them laugh anyway. The social worker noted how natural their interactions had become, how the initial awkwardness had melted into genuine comfort. One rainy afternoon, stuck indoors, they worked on a puzzle together. The twins automatically sorted the edge pieces first, something they'd learned in their previous foster home. The judge watched in amazement as they worked together seamlessly, automatically passing each other pieces they knew the other was looking for. These visits became the highlight of everyone's week. The judge found himself sharing stories about his wife, showing them pictures, and telling them how much she would have loved them. The twins listened intently, asking questions and offering sweet comments that showed they understood the importance of keeping her memory alive. By the end of 6 months, something beautiful had grown between them. Not just hope or possibility, but real connection. They weren't just three people following a visitation schedule anymore. They were becoming something more, something that felt remarkably like family. Just when everything seemed to be moving smoothly, the first real challenge arrived in the form of a thick envelope. The twins' previous foster family had filed a petition to adopt them instead. The judge sat in his kitchen, reading the papers over and over, his morning coffee growing cold beside him. This foster family had a valid argument. They had years of experience raising children, a house full of kids, and a stable 2-parent home. On paper, they looked perfect. The judge knew this because he had seen countless similar cases in his courtroom. Now, being on the other side of the situation felt completely different. The news hit the twins hard during their next visit. The boy became even quieter than usual, pushing his food around his plate without eating. The girl, usually bubbling with energy, sat still, her small hands twisting in her lap. "But we chose you," she whispered, looking up at the judge with worried eyes. Word spread through the courthouse quickly. Some of the judge's colleagues began to distance themselves, worried about being associated with what they saw as an ethical gray area. Others whispered that he was letting emotions cloud his judgment. A few even suggested he was using his position to influence the case. One morning, he overheard 2 clerks talking in the break room. "It's just not appropriate," one said. "A judge adopting kids from his own courthouse. What kind of precedent does that set?" The judge quietly turned around and took a different route to his office, their words weighing heavily on his heart. The social worker called an emergency meeting. She sat across from him, her face serious. "The other family has filed a formal complaint," she explained gently. "They're questioning whether your position as a judge might have unduly influenced the twins' attachment to you." The words stung, but he understood their concern. That evening, he called his sister for advice. As he paced his living room, he shared his fears. "Maybe they're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I'm being selfish, thinking I could do this." His sister listened patiently before responding. "Being a parent isn't about being perfect," she reminded him. "It's about being exactly what your children need." The twins' current foster mother noticed how the stress was affecting them. The girl had started having trouble sleeping, while the boy's grades began to slip. During one visit, she pulled the judge aside. "Those children light up when they're with you," she said firmly. "Don't let anyone make you doubt what's right for them." Support came from unexpected places. A courthouse security guard stopped the judge one morning to share how he had been raised by a single father. The cafeteria lady slipped him an extra cookie with his coffee, along with a note saying she was praying for his family. Small gestures that meant everything during this challenging time. The boy surprised everyone during a home visit evaluation. When the assessor asked why he wanted the judge to be his father, he spoke more words at once than anyone had ever heard from him. He listens, the boy said simply, not just with his ears, but with his whole heart. And he remembers everything we tell him, even the small stuff. The girl had her own way of handling the situation. She started bringing her school assignments to visits, proudly showing off her improving math grades. See, she would say, pointing to her work, we're already a family. We just need the papers to catch up with our hearts. Late one night, as the judge was preparing documentation for yet another hearing, he found a crayon drawing the twins had given him weeks ago. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, with the words "Our Family" written in wobbly letters across the top. Looking at it, he felt his determination strengthen. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the obstacles. The challenge wasn't just about proving he could be a good parent. It was about proving that family isn't defined by traditional expectations. Sometimes, the perfect family is the one that chooses each other, that fights to stay together, that builds their bond one day at a time. After a year of waiting, hoping, and praying, the big day finally arrived. The courthouse felt different that morning, not like the usual busy workplace, but like a place where dreams could come true. The twins sat in their best clothes, their small hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles were white. The girl wore a brand new yellow dress, carefully chosen for the occasion, with matching ribbons in her hair that the foster mother had helped tie just right. The boy's new shoes squeaked on the floor as he walked, his collar slightly crooked despite multiple attempts to straighten it. Their faces showed a mix of hope and worry that would touch even the hardest heart. Everyone waited for the new judge to arrive, someone from a different district, brought in specially to ensure complete fairness. The courtroom was unusually full. The security guard who usually worked the front entrance had switched his shift to be there. The cafeteria lady sat in the back row, dabbing her eyes already with a tissue. The social worker sat with the twins, her hand occasionally patting their shoulders reassuringly. She had brought their whole file. A year's worth of visit reports, evaluations, and progress notes. Next to her sat the children's advocate, ready to speak on their behalf. The previous foster family was there too, sitting quietly with their lawyer. When the judge who hoped to be their father walked in, both twins sat up straighter. He looked different today, more nervous than he'd ever appeared in his own courtroom. He kept touching his tie, a gift the twins had picked out for him during a supervised shopping trip. The little girl had said the blue stripes matched his eyes. As the proceedings began, the courtroom listened to testimony after testimony. The social worker spoke about the remarkable progress she'd seen in the children. The foster mother described how they had started smiling more, trying harder in school, believing in themselves again. Even their teachers had sent letters describing positive changes they'd observed. Then came the moment for the judge to speak. He stood up, and for a second, all his legal training seemed to disappear. He wasn't a judge anymore. He was just a man who wanted to be a father. His voice shook slightly as he began to talk, not about laws or procedures, but about love. He spoke about teaching the girl to understand fractions using pizza slices during their visits. He told them about the boy's quiet wisdom, how he always noticed when someone was feeling sad. He shared how they had taught him to see the world differently, to find joy in simple things like playground swings and puzzle pieces. The twins watched him with shining eyes as he described their first successful attempt at making pancakes together during a supervised home visit. How they had ended up with flour everywhere, but couldn't stop laughing. How the boy had saved half his pancake to share with his sister, and how the girl had drawn happy faces on them with syrup. When the previous foster family's lawyer stood up to speak, everyone held their breath. But instead of arguing against the adoption, he surprised everyone. "Your Honor," he said, "my clients have withdrawn their petition." They've seen how these children light up around him. Sometimes, the right family isn't the most obvious one on paper. The presiding judge asked the twins if they wanted to say anything. The boy, usually so quiet, stood up first. He remembers everything, he said softly. Like how I don't like crusts on my sandwiches, and how my sister needs to sleep with a nightlight. He remembers the important stuff. The girl stood next to her brother, her voice clear and strong despite her trembling hands. We chose him, she said simply. And he chose us back. That's what family means. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom after that. As the judge prepared to make his final decision, the sunlight streamed through the high windows, creating a warm glow in the courtroom. It felt like even the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if three separate stories would finally become one.